that Jessie, who's here behind the Food Connect Shed name there, is keeping an eye on letting people in. So welcome. This session is all about forage gardening, something that I absolutely love. I'd like to begin first, though, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm seated, the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people or Cubbi Cubbi people. I'm up here in a place called Crystal Waters, which is a permaculture eco-village about an hour and a bit north of Brisbane. I've been living up here for about 20 odd years now, and I teach permaculture locally and globally. And I was also part of setting up Northeast Street City Farm, and been around these parts for a very long time and known of the work of Rob and Emma for ever since they've been doing Food Connect. So it's really wonderful to have this chance to be doing this collaboration with them on their fabulous Shed-ucation program. So it's lovely to see you all here. And also to see some of the people familiar from either Jeff, who I had a great podcast conversation with recently. Hi, Jeff. And Joe, who's doing the Permaculture Educators program with me, and other people that I've met along the way too. So wonderful to have you all here. Now, if you'd like to also pop in the chat where you're seated, you might be in different parts of the world. I'm not actually sure where you all are from. So if you know the traditional custodians of the land on which you're seated, I really encourage you to open up the chat and pop that in and say good day. So I will now just take a moment to open up the slides that I've prepared to share with you today. And I just wanted to mention too that I really welcome you to ask questions. I'm going to try and keep the chat on. If I see your questions in the midst of everything, I'll answer it. Sometimes when I get in the flow, I don't notice them, but I will try as much as I can. And I'll scan them at the end also to keep, to make sure I get any of your questions answered. And also feel free to stick around. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, and I'd love to be able to find a way to respond to the questions you have. So thanks for being here, everyone. It's really nice to see you all. So if you wouldn't mind giving me access, Jessie, to sharing my screen, that would be great. I'm just going to, okay, that should be good. Thank you very much. Okay, so I wanted to begin here in exploring about the whole notion of what is a forage garden before we then talk about some of the key things that they need to look for. So this is part of my garden here. This is the permaculture garden that surrounds my home, actually. And what it is essentially a vegetable garden that is it's a herb garden, a fruit garden, a medicinal garden. It's all things woven in together. Now, the difference, I think, in a way of talking about a forage garden, it's very much like a food forest, but it's essentially how I try and create a vegetable garden that acts like nature, that is full of all different kinds of plants that provide us with many of the things that we need in our daily life, but also create this resilience in our garden. That means it's not a slog. We're not trying to fight to make our garden grow. It becomes to have a life of its own, and we become foragers in this space. So let me just see if I can, there we go. So in my garden, this is the space that I welcome all types of groups of people to come in, and it looks different all the time. This is in the midst of summer, what it kind of looks like now. I've been away for 7 weeks in another part of Australia visiting my family. I come back and it's just kind of taken over. So I'm now sort of trimming back the abundance and composting that in different places. I have groups coming here from high school groups who come in, do geography camps, do design studios, have lots of different kind of groups coming through all the time. And I try and do as many different videos and things about the garden as well, to make it a space of learning. So essentially, a forage garden is a permaculture veggie garden that has abundance. It's based on sort of nature's principles, and it's really simple to manage. I mean, it actually takes very little time to keep these kind of systems going once they've got established. And like I said before, it's really just kind of a smaller scale kind of food forest. And it means that every day when I go out harvesting, there's something that I can find. So I can get some, some different sorts of fruits, and there's pumpkins, there's herbs, there's all kind of greens, even the weeds. And behind me over there, I've got different things, like there's bananas growing, there's all sorts of things I can use for teas. So it's never the same. And I often send my kids out with a basket and say, look, just go and see what you can find. And that's kind of what ends up being dinner. So with this, we can make an enormous amount of things, like, from pumpkin soup, or we can make eggy bakes, or, we start to get really creative. And I love that about it, that it really forces you to start to connect with and recognize seasonal foods, and brings you into this possibility of thinking about all the different things you can grow there. So like I said before, it's an educational space. These gardens are just full of life, and you never quite know what you're going to find there. And I love that it's an experimental place. A recent inspiration for me was this beautiful book that it's actually written for the English context, but the whole idea of it really helps me to try and explain what is the difference between, say, just an organic garden and a permaculture garden. And it really is this notion that it has this life. It has its own life force. It's not controlled so much by me. It's a community in and of itself. And like it says on the front of this book, it's like an edible sanctuary in your own backyard. And these can be done in all different scales, from a very small little courtyard through to a whole backyard of a suburban size. I mean, the size of my garden that's here in the eco village is really only just the same as a backyard in an urban area, where the kind of backyard that I grew up with in Melbourne. And what I love about this too is that it creates safe play places, that I know that, as my kids have grown up in the midst of all these gardens, that they can be taste testing all the different things and playing in there and discovering and finding foods and finding resources to do arts and crafts with, and harvesting all different sorts of flowers and making beautiful bouquets, and it's safe, and so that is it. And it's safe food, and it's safe for the planet, because as many of you know, that it takes probably about for all, oh, sorry, I just noticed someone was coming in. For all the people, if everyone in the world lived like a typical Australian, it would take 4 planets. So thinking about our food system and how we can reduce our impact with our food, it makes it safe for the planet too. And I think one of the key things that I find really valuable about these forage gardens is that it builds in resilience. Now, I know that many of you who are members of Food Connect will know that the food system is really fragile, and that the resilience that organizations like Food Connect bring when there is some kind of food crisis going on, energy crisis, something that's going on. But what happens when you actually bring this kind of level of food diversity into your own backyard? It creates even greater level of personal resilience and community resilience. I know that at the start of the pandemic, there was this all of a sudden this flurry of people creating food exchange networks from all the things they've got in their backyard. And the types of plants that you can grow in and around these forage gardens like this gives you the chance to they work at any season. They're there all year round. I'm just wondering, Jessie, would you be able to just check the mute? I can hear a bit of echoing going on, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. So in this picture here, there's things like kaffir limes, and I grow garlic chives instead of garlic. So all different sorts of interesting chilies and capsicums and free-ranging tomatoes and free-ranging pumpkins. I actually bought one of my little pumpkins along here that's similar to the one that's in the picture. Now, I know that normally we wait until the pumpkins get full size, but at the moment mine are taking over the garden. So I've been harvesting lots of these little ones as I've been pulling them back. And this makes a beautiful zucchini alternative or squash alternative. So by foraging through the garden, seeing what I can find, I can come up with an entirely interesting collection of foods that builds in that need to not necessarily have to go and buy a whole lot of food or buy just the standard stock things, and then you can enhance your diversity of foods and nutrients through all of this that you've got growing on. So the other thing that I really love about these gardens is that there's a diversity of flowers and colours and wildlife that's attracted into the garden, and that every day I can go out and grab a bouquet of flowers to bring in to the table. And these are all edible flowers. So there's things like in this here, there's mustard greens, there's basils. I think in there too, there's some radish flowers, some Lagos spinach, and whatever. Oh, and down the bottom there, there's the wattle. And so whatever's growing becomes the bouquet. And if I need to go and visit a friend, there was an elderly friend of mine that I went to visit recently. Her husband is feeling quite ill at the moment, and so instead of taking store-bought and chemical-laden flowers, I just took a bouquet of flowers from the garden. And she said, oh, it was so nice. I was having tea from one of them, like the lemon myrtle that you put in it, and I was snipping off little snips to put in my, to garnish my salads from others. So it's like this edible bouquet as well as being beautiful. And so I love that we can integrate that. The other part too that I think is really wonderful that woven into these forage gardens is having a whole lot of things that are medicinal. And I grow so much turmeric, and in this part of the world, you can. All you need is a little chunk to start. Like you could get some from Food Connect if you get some in your box, and then you plant that. That will grow into a beautiful chunk of turmeric. It's probably not the best time to grow it now. It likes to grow over the summertime, and then we start to harvest in about June. But I grow huge amounts of this and then store it in a bucket of sand, and then just keep taking it out. And I put it in all my curries, I put it in smoothies, I grate it onto salads, I make different kind of turmeric paste or turmeric lattes, all sorts of things. And so there's so many plants within our gardens that we can integrate in this way. And the other thing about the turmeric is you can see all the leaves growing here. When you get them nice and young, they're actually fantastically edible as a leafy green. I once read this book about a forage garden from a woman, Alice Fowler in England, and she had this on the back blurb. I love this bit of it. She wrote, dear husband, whatever his name was, I have something to admit to you. Every time I've been feeding you spinach and feta parcels, or it's not actually spinach, it's all of these hundreds of different sorts of greens and weeds that she's found up and down the street. And there are so many things that we can call spinach, that we don't have to grow like silver beet or spinach. It can be all these other things. And I find that incredibly liberating, actually, as part of the garden. The other thing that I think is really, really great about having a garden like this is it's not only brings a sense of calm because you're not fighting it, but it also is a peaceful way of gardening. It's peaceful in terms of the way that the plants can find their own space. It's about the way that it creates habitat for so many other species, about supporting the way that the soil can create thriving aliveness. And so it is about peace. It is about cultivating a natural way of being in relationship with the place in which we dwell. And that it's about creating community. I think about my garden as being part of my extended community, or I'm part of it, I should say, and that all of the plants together within this space are all forming community as well. And so it's not about companion planting. Forage gardening kind of is sort of companion planting in a supercharged way, that all of these plants are in there together, finding their relationship with one another. And so I create massive great beds where we can really get this connectedness. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The other thing that I think is really great about a forage garden is finding the niches, both in space and in time. And what I mean by that is that in a small space, in a small garden, you can actually create so much more abundance by thinking about it in this way, so that you can create layers and fill in different areas, so that it's not just one plant here and one plant here and there's a fruit tree over here. It's this woven together community of plants, which creates so much more abundance. And then in time as well. So, maybe you've put a fruit tree in one spot, but while it's starting to, get its shape and it's just in its beginning, or might be seasonally deciduous, you can have other things growing in and around underneath it. So it could be seasonal times, or it could be actually the succession of nature. And so we start to think about how we can, if we're staying in that space of being observant about what's going on, we can keep filling the gaps and helping to increase that diversity. And we come up with extraordinary, interesting guilds of plants. So in this picture here, I've got the mandarins growing at the top, and there's comfrey that grows around the edge, which kind of helps to keep improving the soil. There's a ground cover of Vietnamese mint that creeps across, and that creates like moisture in the soil, and Vietnamese mint's kind of like a beautiful alternative that's simple here for coriander, particularly in the warm times. And then chia, the chia that you buy, the little black or white seeds, you can just toss that around and they will grow up. You can be harvesting the leaves, or you can wait till they get there. You can see their little mauve flowers here, and then you can harvest the seeds off that and then just chop and drop that back into the soil as well. So there's a whole lot of things that are going on. Some things are annuals, some things are perennials, some things are trees that will last for decades. So let's sort of think about, like, what are the essentials? Let's have a think about how we can tend to our essentials in the garden. So the first thing is starting with the soil. And we need to get to know what's going on in the soil and focus on that, because unless we bring our soil to life and to focus on that, everything else is going to be hard. And bringing the soil to life gives the capacity of your garden to host so many more plants in community, and also helps to make far more nutrient dense foods, and it also holds a lot more moisture as well. So one of the key things that we need to do is actually feed this. This is the mycelial web that exists underneath the soil. There's so much going on underneath the soil that we don't really think about. And once we started to discover and understand what's going on with these, you may have picked up a log before and seen those white threads, these hyphae, incredibly important part of the decomposition process. But this for plants is actually one of the most important things for creating a thriving garden and a thriving forage garden. So essentially, we're wanting to think about creating a healthy forage garden. Really, at the basis of everything, what we need to be doing is focusing on feeding this, because these little threads are like forages in the soil. They go 50 times deeper than the roots do, and they're 100 times longer than roots. And what they do too is they help to get right down into the cellular level of the soil and bring up nutrients and moisture that the roots could never get. Actually, most of the edible plants in the world rely on this relationship. So these mycorrhizal fungi, like root extenders, they're kind of attached onto the end, and there's a relationship. So the plant up the top is bringing sort of the carbs down to these plants, and then they go and get the nutrients, and they can help to also break up minerals and rocks and mine for the plant. So plants that have this relationship are much more healthier, and they will withstand drier temperatures. They'll withstand the fluctuations in the day. They are so much more resilient to pests and all kinds of things because they have this relationship. Now, the other really interesting thing about this is that the community that I talked about at the top is actually a community underneath too. These connect the plants. And so it's kind of like an internet of the underground where all these plants are connected. If something's going on over here, something's getting eaten, it actually sends messages through this into the underground to other plants, and so that they will release something which will actually help to prevent pests from coming onto them. And so this one almost becomes a sacrificial plant. And it's so interesting watching this. Now, what is it that helps to keep these thriving? Well, it's a fungus. So we need to think about that. Like, what makes fungus grow? It needs to be sort of dark and moist. And if you think about these threads, and the threads of connection, it doesn't want to be chopped so much. So really we're looking at creating very sort of low-till protected type of food systems. And one of the things that I think, one of the books that I found that I absolutely loved, that was all about this world of how fungi makes, what does he say? How fungi makes our worlds, change our minds and shapes our future. Merlin Sheldrake, which is an absolutely phenomenal name too, wrote this book, The Entangled Life. And if you're looking for an interesting read, I highly recommend this one. So part of supporting the idea of enlivening the soil, we need to rehydrate the soil. So some of the ways of doing this, often, you know, when I see vegetable gardens get started, you know, there's people sell all those raised up garden bed things, but what happens is that they dry out really quickly, which actually diminishes the capacity of the mycorrhizal fungi to thrive, and also diminishes the possibilities for other life to thrive because it gets dry and hot, not the best environment for soil ecology. So as much as possible, keep it in the ground. And if you're on a slope like this garden here, you might want to have a terrace, but make the beds as big as you can. And then just try and keep as much soil. So a terracing thing helps to slow down the moisture, or some way of slowing. We have this sort of idea in this mantra, I'd say maybe you could call it in permaculture. So it's slow it, spread it, sink it, store it. So you need to slow the water down so it can sink into the ground. You need to sort of, if you're on a contours, you can try and spread it as well to sink it, rather than having this sort of water gushing in and rushing away. We want to hold it there. When it's in there, we need to hold it with lots of organic matter. So that's lots of compost, and also lots of these sort of mycorrhizal fungi. That it's actually 50% of the topsoil is, in healthy soil, is that mycorrhizal fungi, and it helps to create like that sponge-like effect. So we need to do lots of mulching. We need to protect the soil, mulch it, create living mulch covers, and feed the soil as much as possible. So one of the things that we often think about when we're trying to get a vegetable garden going, is we want to feed the plants. Whereas I'd like to encourage you to think about feeding the soil. So when you're feeding the soil, you're actually focusing on feeding the soil ecology. And one of the simple things I do with this, you can see the little compost bin in there. I have these movable compost bins. So I look around the garden where it needs some attention and love, and I'll put the compost bin there. And so then I keep filling up the compost bin. And then instead of having a compost area down the back where I always take the scraps, and that means that bit probably gets almost over compost in a way, like it could be leachate that's almost causing contamination. You're constantly moving the compost bin around. So when it gets full and it's half done, you lift off the bin, move the bin somewhere else, spread that material out, that composted, it could be half composted, mulch over the top, and then that's going to make an enormous difference. So if I'm trying to think about wanting to get an area ready for planting a fruit tree, for example, I'll stick a compost bin on it first, allow the soil life to kind of open up the soil, to enrich the soil there, and then that's where I'll plant, rather than trying to dig a hole and put a little bit of compost in. Because it's not just the compost, you want the life, you want that activated. I don't know if you've ever made compost before, but there's something about when you put all that material on, like, where does it come from? You all of a sudden get all of these things thriving, like the soil just comes alive in that space. There'll be worms coming in, and you'll find all these critters, and it starts to get that softness. That's what you're looking for. So I keep moving compost bins all the way around the garden, or, you know, if you haven't got compost bins, even just digging the compost into different spots around your garden, move it around. And that way you're thinking about feeding the soil life, because then the soil life will feed your plants. That's the point of that. And as much as possible to do things like chop and drop. try not to take things out of your garden. So if you've got some materials, you need to trim a garden, like see if you can chop it and put it back on the garden. So the more you can add, it doesn't just keep building up. The soil life will take it in. It's actually interesting. I just been up into Mary Cancross Forest, a rainforest just up from me here. And you walk along the path and there's all these little leaves sticking up along the edge, sort of twisted. And you look down and they're actually being drawn down into the soil by these enormous, they're quite big, these big worms. And so in your garden, if you chop and drop, you don't need to dig it in. The soil life knows how to take it in and put it where it wants it to be, in the structure and in the form and combinations that it wants to be. So be like a forest, layer things on the top. Like in the rainforest up there's all the leaf falling and the fruits falling and twigs falling and little paddy melons going through pooping. That doesn't just sit there. It just gets drawn in. It keeps feeding that soil ecology. So chop and drop is really important. So I actually plant things that I know that I can use as chop and drop. And one of those is Comfrey, which is what this plant is here. A brilliant plant for activating the soil, activating the compost, particularly looking for a lot of biomass really quickly. This is really great. So I mentioned about the movable bins before, but there's another thing that you can do as well. And this is a worm tower. So instead of having a worm farm, on your veranda or in your carport or something, you can actually stick your compost worms right in the garden. And they can be you can even put them in a pot. If you've got like a nice big pot, you can stick it in the middle. So I sink in these pipes, and at the bottom of the pipe, the bit that's underground, so I dig it in about 30 centimeters, and I put holes. I drill some holes in that, and then that's underground. And then the bit that's up on the top is where I put in the food scraps. So I have a few scattered around the garden. So one day I might come in and put in this one. The next day it might be another one. And the compost worms come in. There's 2,000 different sorts of earthworms at least in the world, and these ones are the ones that like the top bit. So they'll kind of come up and process that for you. And they don't go very far because they like the fresh stuff. So they come up and they come up your pipe and process all that and draw that down. And then some other things come in and take it further out in your garden. So it's like these little acupuncture points in your garden where you can feed the soil. Now, the thing about these worm towers is I really like low maintenance worm farms, because during the nighttime, they'll come up and feed in the tower when it's not so hot. And during the day, they'll actually go down into the soil, into the below soil layer where it's nice and cool. And they can monitor where they are. So it's a really beautiful way to care for your worm farm, because I know that in some of these black worm farms, it can sometimes get quite hot. So I do also have these worm farms going around as well, and I have them just out the front of my house where it's nice and shady, and I know that the worms are going to get attended to really regularly, which is kind of the key thing. And you can put all different sorts of things, and it's really interesting to think about what you can put into a worm farm. I try and actually choose a lot of things in my house, even my clothing and anything that I use in and around the house. Anything, even like sheets or everything that is compostable. That's kind of my criteria of trying to buy things, that it's compostable as much as possible. I know it's not possible for everything, because as soon as it's finished its life, I can't fix it anymore. It goes into a worm farm. And my son here, Hugh, big long streak of a kid, he was pushing his feet through his sheet in the bed, and I was trying to fix him and it just wasn't working. So I ended up putting it into the worm farm, and I came back a couple of months later, and all I got was the elastic string off the end. So I pulled that out, stuck that somewhere else, and the rest of the sheet had disappeared into the worm farm. So everything from our household can go out into these living systems, which then I use that compost to activate getting new seedlings happening, and the juice that comes out of that for watering the garden. So there's lots of different compost systems. I think this is what I want to say as well, that it's not just one. You don't just have a worm farm. Try and put the composting, that way of feeding the soil, again, just scatter it everywhere, and that way it'll help. And as much as possible, really try and go for the kind of the no dig method, which is really just I have a lot of perennial plants growing. So in this picture here, you can see There's things like sorrel and perennial Welsh onions. There's perennial garlic chives. There's perennial kales. And I just, there's some annuals going in there too, some self-seeding things. When there's a bit of a gap, I'll just layer on more compost on the top of that. And then from there, what I'll do is put more mulch on and plant into that. And so I'm never kind of digging it up and turning it over and sort of chopping up what's going on underneath. It's always just top dressing. And the other thing that I try and do with this too is never just clear out a whole garden all in one, because when you start to pull out the roots of everything, you're pulling out all the sort of the little homes for where you can recolonize that spot. Sorry, Daniela, I'm just going to try and mute you if that's all right. I'm actually, that's okay. So what I was saying was that I think this whole idea of no dig is essential for creating really thriving soil, which is going to be supporting your forage garden. So I focused a lot on soil because I think this is absolutely essential. I think the focus on building the soil life and protecting that soil life and rehydrating the soil is kind of your number one thing. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, and it's going to take everything that you've got to put out there, like all of the, the leaf clippings or the coffee grounds or the compost that you've got from your house or whatever you can find, just to keep adding and adding and adding. And you can see the life, if you've ever been down to Northeast Street City Farm. When we first started there, we started no digging gardening there because we couldn't actually get a mattock into the ground to dig it. We were kind of all learning there. I was in my early 20s. And so I think the whole idea about just adding and adding and adding and allowing the life to do the digging for you in the way that makes sense for it, it's more of a natural process of time, but you'll be surprised actually how quickly things can turn around. It's absolutely extraordinary. So with the planting, and so once you've got your soil thinking happening, it's thinking differently too about how you're planting. And I've alluded to this a bit too about this whole idea of having a diverse community of plants, and that your vegetable garden is a mixture of flowers and herbs and vegetables and fruit trees and even bush tucker plants. So right in front of you here on the right is a lemon myrtle tree, a native bush tucker plant, which I have right on the corner of my garden, so I can go out and grab the leaves for tea. I've always put it in soup. It's fantastic in stir fry. Take a leaf off that, put it in a tub of yogurt, and you'll get lemon myrtle yogurt. So I just take a leaf, put it on overnight, and the scent oozes through it. It's absolutely magnificent. I came up with that idea because I accidentally, one night I was making a curry, and the garlic chives, which I don't know if you can see them, there's sort of strappy green things in the middle. I was chopping them up and mixing them with some yogurt to make like a really nice dip to go with the curry. And one of the little tiny bit of garlic chives flipped into the yogurt. I didn't know until the morning when I put it onto my muesli for the morning. And it was like, oh no, garlic flavored yogurt on muesli is so not nice. And I thought, well, if one little bit of leaf of something very aromatic can go through yogurt in such a quick period of time, I'm sure other things can. So I started experimenting, and one of my favorites has become, my mouth's watering now thinking about it, one of my favorites become the lemon myrtle. And so what you can see also in this garden, there's cassava plant at the back there. That's sort of the palmate leaf plant. So you can eat both the tops and the bottoms of that. There's the papaya. There's ground covers of sweet potato going, and all different sorts of things, herbs and vegetables all around. A key thing that I think is part of this too is this idea of creating big beds. Often we try and sort of have nice little neat beds that we could go all the way around. I try and flip that idea that we have a big bed with little pathways that go into it. So on this slope, for example, I have this big terraced bed like here, and little keyhole pathways that come into it. So when the water comes in, it soaks along the contour and then soaks into these little keyhole pathways that act like a soak. So it's this sort of rainwater, self-watering garden. And then the big garden then creates this space where all of that soil life can happen. And this And those little pathways change over time. So say, for example, my Tamarillo here gets too big. I might just move the pathway over a little bit. So there's, moving out those hard edges and just becoming more fluid with what it is and keeping that space. So there's no reason necessarily why to have lots of little beds if you can just have one big bed and mulch the whole thing and have a diversity of plants with, maybe you could have stepping stones through it, or you could have little keyhole watering beds, watering pathways going in there too. So big beds is really helpful. This, by the way, is the Perma Youth, that are an extraordinary group of young people who are connecting around the world with Perma Youth. And sometimes they have camps and they have festivals and a podcast and they have a radio show. If you've got any people in your life who are in their teenage years, then definitely connect them in with Perma Youth. So that's permayouth.org. I see there's questions coming in there, but I'm just going to come back to them later if that's okay. And if you know an answer to one of the questions, feel free and go ahead and respond to that too. So the other thing as well as diversity is thinking about the layers. So I talked a bit about space and time before, and I think this is a really important part of creating a forage garden, and it's bringing the food forest ideas into your vegetable garden as well. So you can see here at the bottom, there's different sorts of kales growing, there's taros poking up, there's some nasturtiums, there's a little bit of asparagus, some comfrey, then a fruit tree layer and some bananas. And, there's things that are underneath the ground, there's things that are crawling across the ground, there's things that are in the middle and above. And then there's sort of vines that can go up as well. So depending on the space that you have, you might have less layers or more layers. And just play with it. Feel free. Like, the way to learn about what goes with what is about just experimenting and try and fill the gaps. I often think about filling the gaps with thinking about, well, if I've got more vertical space available, I'll try and find something that's more upright. If I have a big gap, I might try and find something that's more spacious. If there's something like the taro, which has big roots underneath, I'll find something that has fibrous roots to go next to it. So it's just kind of playing, and each time it's just this iterative process, and then observe what works. Because often with the companion planting charts, often they were developed for other countries or other places, and particularly here in the subtropics, if you listen to this from the subtropics, this kind of bigger community of plant approach seems to be far more successful. And I do encourage you to try and think about how you can include as many different multifunctional plants as possible into this forage garden. So, for example, the mulberry plant, obviously, you can get mulberries and you can do all sorts of things with the mulberries that you produce. But I wonder if you knew too that you can actually make a tea out of the leaves. So all of the young leaves you can use as a mulberry leaf tea. It's also a fabulous chop and drop material. It's a great chicken food. I grow it up around the western side of my chicken house to provide summer shade. And then in the wintertime, it drops its leaves. Great for the compost, and then the sun comes into the chicken house. So thinking about the plants that you're putting in and how they can be useful in many different ways. And then picking things too that are super hardy, like pomegranates. It's so ridiculously hardy. And so easy to grow. You just need a snip of a cutting and stick it in the ground. The other thing too about pomegranates is that you can shape them. You can keep them down as a small hedge so they don't shade out your garden, and you can pop them in the middle of a veggie garden, just beautifully easily. And while they're not fruiting, you can actually be eating the young leaves as well. So I often look to all the different parts of the plants that you can eat. And this is part of that forage garden idea, that it's not just thinking, okay, well, that's a pomegranate, I'm going to wait for the pomegranate fruit. Like, what else can we do with this plant in the middle of this? So we can eat the young leaves, we can be trimming and chopping and dropping. We can use it in a way to shape and provide protection and shade for some more plants that need a bit of shade in the middle of a hot summer, for example. So there's lots of different things that we can play with in this space. And I always love to include all different kinds of legume shrubs. And this one here is a particularly wonderful one. It's called Pigeon Pea. Pigeon Pea, it's a legume. You can see by the little pea flower that it's of the pea family, and also the fact that it has pods. That means it's of the pea family. It's a legume family. And this means it also is fixing nitrogen in the soil. So when it finishes, when this particular plant lasts 4 or 5 years, you can leave the roots in the ground, just trim it off at the top, leave the roots in the ground, and they'll be like a slow release fertilizer back into your soil. Now, that's the same with any kind of legume. So if you're growing beans or peas, when they're finished, don't pull them out. Chop it off and leave the roots in the ground, and so they will be able to nourish the soil for a lot longer. Pigeon peas also make fantastic chop and drop material. You can use them to create those microclimates that I was talking about. And the peas, you can either eat them young and fresh like this, or when they've dried, you can actually collect them as a dry bean. You can either then sprout them, or you can cook them up as you would a dal. And it's been used for thousands of years in places like India as a dal. So they're a super useful plant to incorporate. And the comfrey and the pigeon pea and things like an edible canna are some of the plants that I've used to help me get forage gardens started all over the place, because they grow quickly, they're hardy, they create the microclimates, and they activate the soil, which means you then can add the more delicate things. Often there's a tendency to want to go to the more delicate things first, which makes it harder to get going. So start with the really robust things. So other things that are really robust are things like cranberry hibiscus, which also adds brilliant color. Now, hibiscus you can eat the leaves of this. I'm absolutely amazed. When I grew up in Melbourne, I had no idea you could eat all this kind of stuff. It's this revelation to kind of see all the different things. There's 30,000 varieties of 30,000 different sorts of edible things in the world, but yet mostly we rely on 3 things to feed us with most of our calories in the world. So I'm super excited about the possibilities of exploring all the other stuff. So this is a hibiscus, cranberry hibiscus. You can eat the leaves, cook it up as you would a green. It's for cooking. I don't eat this one raw. It's a sister of Rosella that you get those beautiful red flowers and calyxes that you can eat, like Rosella Jam. I've got a fridge full of Rosella syrup that my daughter made last year. It's still going there. So instead of, if we need some sweetness in a cake, she might use that instead, or as a cordial. Not that I like to encourage my kids to have cordial, but it's a way of processing them. Mostly what I try and do with the Rosella though is dry them, and they make the most magnificent tea, particularly when you put a couple of leaves of the Rosella in with like some lemon myrtle, and the sort of the redness just comes out really high in vitamin C, and then you get no sugar that way. But also, I mentioned the Rosella only because it's a hibiscus, and you can also eat the leaves of that. Again, often when we plant hibiscuses in the garden, we wait for the calyx, but you can eat the flowers and you can eat the leaves as well. There's so many robust foods that you can throw all out your garden to be foraging on at any time of year. Or sometimes there's things that are flourishing at one time, and then there's a pulse and another time and another time. So this is cassava, and I mentioned it before. You could see it in the back of one of the pictures I showed you. Now, the leaves, all of the leaves of this are edible. You need to cook it. So it's the problem with cassava, and why most people don't like it, is because it has cyanide in the leaves and the roots, but 1/10 of the world's population rely on this for most of their carbohydrates. So it's totally edible. You just need to prepare it. You just need to cook it. So either you pound it to get, like in Africa, they were showing me how they pounded it to release the cyanide and then oxidate it, and then it was fine to eat, or you just cook it up. So it's only a fraction. I know it sounds very scary, but anyway, if you cook it up cyanide for a couple of, like maybe 15 minutes, and then throw away the water, you can use this green for everything, and it's incredibly abundant. I'm always surprised at how much food we can get. And Indigenous communities knew this, that there was plants that you had to process in different ways, like black beans, for example, absolutely poisonous if you try and eat it straight, but when you know how to process it, it's totally fine, and it's so easy to grow. Other things that we can grow that aren't toxic, which are easy to grow around these parts and are just abundant too, with things like sweet potato. I mostly grow sweet potato these days as a ground cover underneath fruit trees, and they just come back when the season is right. So as long as you don't dig up all of the sweet potatoes from the last season, they'll just recolonize that area, and then we can have fruit trees growing up and taros and cassavas, sweet potatoes underneath. And the sweet potato leaf is one of the best leafy greens. It's so delicious. It doesn't have any oxalic acid in it, so it's actually, you can even eat it raw and pop it in your smoothies. And it's super abundant. Anyone who's grown sweet potato before, you just one pot and you can get enough leafy greens to keep you going for all the greens that you need. You can even grow it in like a hanging pot and have it coming down with its tendrils, and just snip it off and put that into your cooking. So whether you want it for the root or just the greens, this is a fantastic ground cover. Other root crops that you could think about growing, I mentioned turmeric. Of course, you can stick potatoes in and amongst this as well. I'm always sort of digging up little clumps of potatoes. This one I really love too. This is called Yaekon, or Peruvian ground apple. So there's two different parts that you can eat here. It's actually the sunflower family. So these crowns, these red bits at the top, you can eat those, but you can see how they're sprouting. If you kind of take those, snap them off and plant them, you'll get a whole lot more. So I snap some off, plant them back, so they'll come next year. So it's this whole idea of just getting things, keeping on coming back. And then I take some of those and pop them into, you can actually eat them raw, or you can just slice them up and use them in a stir fry, grate them into a salad. It's really nice. But this long brown root, you can just peel it and eat it like an apple. It's sweet and it's crunchy and it's delicious. Or another way I like to use it is I peel it and I slice it up finely and use it as like a dip biscuit. It's kind of like you're making like a nice little wafer from it. And from one plant, you can get 20 kilos of this. And it's an extraordinary amount of abundance you can grow in such a small space. And then, of course, you can have things growing up, up the side of your house or up the shed. Passion fruits, for example, are a wonderful one too, or grapes. Think about incorporating in amongst all this some more seasonal annuals. So what I've talked about a lot is the perennials and the hardy plants and things that just keep coming back. But in amongst that, find the things that thrive at the time. So at the moment, it's been hot and wet up here. So things like snake beans that can grow, like I can't even fit them on the screen, massively long snake beans. I mentioned too about leaving the roots. And I think this is an important point as part of this idea of getting the forage garden going, that, we have a tendency to clear an area before we start again. I always leave the roots, the crop before, and then just keep adding on top of that. And so here in this section here, there were some pumpkins that were growing, and then you can see the sweet potatoes are starting to come back. I've popped in some, cranberry hibiscus there. Sometimes if I've got things like, say, corn growing, that will grow up. I'll harvest that, I'll knock that back, and then I'll plug in something like broad beans for the next season, and then they'll come up and I'll harvest those, and then that goes down, and then plug in something else. So it's just this idea of leaving the roots, because it adds structure, it adds the potential for holding moisture, and it helps to feed that soil life. And it's just, I mentioned that I went away for a while and the pumpkins took over, and they literally did try and get inside the house. It took over. But in amongst all that, I mentioned earlier about, the little pumpkins that you can harvest off that. Actually, all of the leaves are edible of a pumpkin. This is in this season now one of my best leafy greens as well. And they come nice and big. You steam it up for a couple of minutes. You can put rice and veggies in and make these beautiful wraps. You can eat the young shoots. So if you think too about this concept of time that I mentioned before in the garden space, you can also think about it in terms of what you're eating over a season on all the different plants that you're foraging. So you can eat the pumpkin in all these different stages. You can eat the flowers, you can eat the shoots, you can eat these sliced up. A friend of mine just telling me today that she just walks through the garden and just eats these fresh, just like that. Or you can wait until your pumpkin is ripe and what you're used to eating. And then everything except the stalk I eat, the skin, the seeds. The seeds are fantastic. If you actually scoop them out and wash them off a bit, and I put them in like a toaster, like either a sandwich toaster, or put them in the oven with a bit of tamari on it. It makes a beautiful snack. So I often say to people that you can probably grow 10 times more than you thought possible simply by shifting the way that what you think is food. And it's often because we don't get this type of thing in the shops that we don't recognize it. If we buy pumpkin, in our minds, we see this pumpkin at the bottom. We don't see all the leaves. We don't see all the young ones. We don't see the flowers. We don't see all this other food. And when we're talking about food waste, it's really quite interesting to think, we've talked about how, we hear figures about how at least a third of all the food grown is wasted. I would hazard to say that there's far more than that, because if you think of a field of sweet potato, none of the leaves are ever harvested, or a field of pumpkins, none of the leaves of that either, or the young ones, or any of these other parts. And then when we get it home, we chop off all these bits, scoop it off, and we only left with a small part. So most of the food that all this energy is poured into in the world to grow food is actually wasted. This is the beauty of a forage garden, is that we eat the snips and the shoots and the flowers and the roots and all the different parts. And so in a small space, we can grow an enormous amount of food. And I think, and at the same time, improving the soil, like drawing down carbon into the soil, creating habitat for all kinds of things in the midst of urban areas. And at the same time, too, creating really healthy and dynamic food. And trying to get things self-seeding as well. So getting the garden to have its own life. So this is my daughter, growing up a little bit now. She heads the Perma Youth group. This is a self-seeded purple vein mustard spinach that just grows in my garden without me trying any year now at all. I can't remember the last time I actually planted it. It just plants itself. And one leaf of that just makes so, it's all you need for a salad, or it's all you need for making like a stir fry. And then when it flowers, it goes to seed really quickly, but the flowers that come off, you can eat these flowers. They make fantastic like salad garnishes. I just walk through the garden munching on them, making sure there's not a bee on them. But they also have so much color and so much nectar that I make sure I have all of them around the garden all the time, providing habitat for the pollinators. And things like the perennial basil or any other kind of plant like this also makes brilliant pollinator food as well. So another thing that I really like about the perennial basil is that it's always there in the garden. It's always buzzing with bees, but also because it's a shrub. What I find is that little birds come and hang out in it. And I watch them as they come out, and they'll stand on the side of the kale, and they'll peck little pests off the kale and then come back into the bush, and they'll jump from bush to bush, hidden and protected from bigger predatory birds. So having this forage garden with the different layers and these hidey holes for the little birds, it's going to make your life as a forage gardener or a gardener of any kind so much easier, because the little birds are insectivorous. And so they help to come and get the things in your garden that are causing you problems. So by creating the habitat in the soil, creating the habitat for your helpers, creating habitat for your pollinators, it shifts how you think about gardening. You're not doing the gardening of the vegetables, you're doing the gardening of the community of life that is your garden. And it creates so much, there's so many different things that end up coming into your garden. And then, things like I mentioned before, the flowers for beauty, for bringing inside, but also things like calendula are edible. The leaves are edible, and I make beautiful salves for sort of elbows or face, or like a calendula oil for face. There's so much you can do with these plants. And then I really try and find ways also to integrate animals as much as possible, because this is a big problem in our agricultural system, that we have all the animals over here and all the plants going over here, and that's why we get pollution and waste, because it's not integrated. So how can we bring those things together? So I have the forage garden also creates a beautiful environment to be able to integrate things like chickens, for example, because they don't damage it as much as they would a more annual garden. So I try and keep the annual garden as somewhere where they don't go, but the rest of it they can go into. And then I try and welcome wildlife as much as possible too, from the birds to the bees to the insects to all the soil life underneath. And I do also get, I met an echidna today, and I met a carpet python yesterday, and I've always got my wonderful family of kangaroos and wallabies in the garden, bush turkeys, everything is there. And this forage garden helps me to find a way to work with them. So I'm not trying to fight them or exclude them. The kangaroos eat the grass and the weeds. I've watched them over the time. The wallabies eat the sweet potato, but they go along the wall and trim it off for me. So I've kind of created wildlife paths. I've watched where they've gone and designed the garden around them. And it creates this beautiful place to be. So it's really about this idea of, I'm working with nature, allowing nature to inform the design that you have for your garden, to become a forager within that space, a little bit from here, a little bit from there, rather than planting and pulling. It's like a leaf off here, a snip off there, a flower off there, a fruit off here, and not take it all from the one plant, but move along the plant and take it. Skipping a lot. And to be responsive to what's happening. Let the garden inform what your meals are. Let the garden inform what should be the next type of thing. I notice, say, for example, what's popping up in self-seeding. So if I see pumpkin self-seeding, I've not planted pumpkin for 15 years as well. When I see that coming up, I think, oh, okay, it's now time to plant all the other kind of gourd families. So then I pop in things like zucchinis or squashes that don't self-seed as much. And that then I watch and notice, because you can read a chart, but a chart doesn't tell you exactly what's going on. Your garden tells you, and you can feel it and you notice it. So being out in your garden every day, finding something you can harvest every day so that it takes you out there and you just notice. Create a beautiful seating space out there in the midst of it so you can enjoy it and watch what's happening. And then always kind of keep this bigger picture of what it is. What's this garden about? The garden is helping to create resilience and good food for you, but also this regenerative approach of, being a contributor to what's going on in the world today. And we can do that from the garden and connecting with other people. So I have a few other bits and pieces that I wanted to share with you. I have a blog with hundreds of posts and a YouTube channel with hundreds of films and a podcast that I talk with lots of different people about the philosophy and the practice of permaculture. So I've put together a little email if you wanted to get that, and it has all the links and also a longer masterclass that's about forage gardening. You can copy this one out. I might try and see if I can pop it in the chat in a bit. So thank you. Thank you for listening to this. Now I'm going to open up for questions. If you want to chat, you can put your hand up and do it that way, or I'll also go through the questions that you've put through here. I just wanted also to point out some of the other things that I've got going on too. So the Permaculture Education Institute.org, that's where we have free masterclasses that happen every month as well. You can dive into those. The blog and the podcast come through our Permaculture Life. I also work with refugees across East Africa. Last year, we were able to support over 1,500 people to receive free permaculture courses, create gardens. Right at this very moment, there's another 2,000 people who've just arrived from the Democratic Republic of Congo into Uganda, and they've got nothing. We're just the people who we work with there, who are actually refugees themselves, are saying this is the best thing that they can possibly be doing, calling for support to get the new arrivals set up with seeds and tools and gardens. So we're working to help with that. That's what we do with the charity. And then, of course, the Perma Youth that I mentioned. And that's that link again to the bit.ly Forage Garden. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. And if you'd like to ask any questions and pop your hand up, go ahead and do that. If you remember down the bottom, you can use the reactions and do this sort of raise hand thing. But I'm going to go through the questions while so Nicole said something about she's bought 5 different sorts of spinach from Northeast Street City Farm. Yes, there are so many different sorts of spinaches. I've got Suriname spinach, Brazilian spinach, Okinawan spinach, all these perennial sorts of spinach, but then also all these other things that you can be eating as you're just walking through. The pumpkin, the sweet potato, even the weeds, you know, like chickweed. What else was I eating the other day? Oh, amaranth. You find wild amaranth. But then also lots of trees that you can eat the leaves of as well. I did this whole series last year on YouTube talking about how you can eat all these different parts and what are the different ways that you can use the trees that are growing in your garden. For example, I have this olive tree, for example, that's growing in my garden that very rarely produces any olives. And I wonder whether there's anyone else of you who put in olives thinking, great, I'm going to get olives, and then there's no olives, or there's just a handful, and it's thinking, I have this massive great olive tree that I was looking at, thinking, I'd really like a bit more space to have some more fruit trees. We might have to part ways, olive tree. And then I went and did some research, and I started thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot olive leaf extract. I don't know, have any of you ever used olive leaf extract? You know, it's olive leaf. So then I went and worked out how to make that, and it looked a bit complicated. So then I discovered, oh, well, you could just do olive leaf tea. And all I could ever find was dried olive leaves. And then I researched a bit further and found, sure, you can just chop off leaves off the olive tree, strip them up and stick them in a pot and make an olive leaf tea, which has all the qualities of olive leaf extract, but just milder. So if you just sip, if you're feeling a bit unwell, you can just sip olive leaf tea throughout the day, or have it anytime. It's just like a green tea as well. So there's so many things like that I love discovering. It's so amazing. So there's a thing also from Nicole too, saying about you can't plant things in the ground, so you have to do container plants with bigger pots. So yes, this is a huge thing to try and explore. You can, however, in the biggest pot that you can find, often when we fill up with potting mix and stuff, it's dead soil, denatured soil. The stuff you get in bags has no life in it whatsoever. So you need to try and add life into that. And it's totally possible. You can either stick one of those worm towers in the middle, or even if you've got some kind of compost or something like a worm farm somewhere else and put that into it, it will start to colonize that. And in a big pot, you can also have perennials and then have other things that you poke in and around. So the biggest pot that can give you this more stable temperature and more stable moisture and have life in it, it is doable. It's never going to be the same as having something in the ground, and you won't be able to get that kind of life where you have that sort of great big mycelial network. However, you can do more by just enhancing that size. There are actually things you can do. You can buy mycelium powder that can inoculate the soil, and you can get something happening. So look for that. I would suggest you do that, and then it'll take you a little bit along the way. Yeah. Jeff's saying has a small compost and worm, and you regularly repot using that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was just trying to say then too. The more that you use that material, it creates that beautiful life force there. Slowly shifting from plastic to terracotta. Constrained by not going so large that I can't move the pot. Challenges. Yes, exactly. I know, like having the terracotta pots is really nice, but you need to have your trolley or your pots on wheels or something like that. Oh, it's hard, isn't it? Gosh. Okay. Did anyone want to call out a question, or should I just keep going through these? So there was Nicole also mentioned about wicking beds. So, the reason why I don't use wicking beds here where I am is because I want everything in the ground and I want that connectedness. However, if you are doing a pot type of thing, having a wicking bed is a really great option because it gives you that chance of having that water resilience. So it's got that water reservoir, but you only ever have a small, like 30 centimeters of soil on the top. And what you want to try and do is get as much life in that as possible. So again, inoculating it with life, with worms, with castings, with compost, even digging in some fresh compost to feed the soil as well. So I think it's possibly even more important. Well, no, I shouldn't say that, not more important, but it's as important to feed the soil of pots as it is of the ground, and you do need to replenish them more regularly.
Morag, Rhonda had a message about no-dig gardens and lawns. Does she need to remove the lawn?
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Great. I'm gradually scrolling my way down the path. There's quite a lot of messages here. No, like I just leave it all there. Even weeds, if there's anything in there, I actually love to have as much organic matter as possible. So the lawn, you're going to get the grassy stuff, which is going to break down and add to the organic matter. And if you've got all the weeds, the roots, either of the weeds or of the grasses, that will actually become new organic matter. And the reason there's two different ways that you often see no-dig gardens happening. One of the first ways that you'll see in most books is having sort of the ground with the grass, and then you put like newspaper on the top, and then you put compost and then mulch. I flipped that over, and the video that I have on the YouTube channel, and that's in the link if you've got that, I talk about how what you do is you just kind of feed the soil first. So you're feeding you add compost, you might add like leafy greens, liquid fertilizers of worm castings, whatever you can find around. You just put it all on top. Chop and drop the weeds in there. And then on top of that, you put the newspaper, not underneath. So the weed barrier goes on top. So that means you can have all different sorts of things. As long as you've kind of overlaid your weed barrier nicely, it suppresses that. And also what happens is that all of that compost material goes down into the soil. You're feeding the soil. When you're thinking about the other way around, it's about, I'm going to put the compost on top because that's feeding the plants. Again, flipping the idea that to create this beautiful forage garden with this rich soil life, you need to be feeding the soil. So put it all down first, leave all the weeds in, leave all the grass in, leave all the roots, put compost on top, put your weed barrier, because I bet even if you're a master gardener, you're going to have weeds in your compost of any sort. I don't know, it could even be like, you end up with a field of tomatoes or something, but on that, and then mulch on the top. So yeah, there's really clear instructions on how to do that on the YouTube and the blog as well that I'd like you to direct you to. And if you spend the time removing all that stuff, you're kind of losing a huge amount of resources. Yeah. Any other questions that I missed here? What's the best mulch to use on top? Okay, anything that is like a dry material that is kind of seed free. So, and I try and find something that's organic as well. But you can. So I grow lots of things to try and use as my own mulch. So, for example, lemongrass. I chop and drop lemongrass. I grow an edible canna. I chop and drop that. I use the mulberry leaves when they fall. I use that. If you're just trying to get a nice sort of veggie garden and we want the straw look, the organic sugarcane mulch is probably a good one to get started because it's fine and it can scatter around things. Where I am up here, I'm not sure whether you can get it as well. There's a local farmer who bales up grass hay. It doesn't you don't want the lucerne hay. You don't want the nutrients in it because the nutrients are just going to get evaporated by the sun. It's just sitting on top. It's like a blanket. All it is to just keep the moisture and the temperature stable underneath, and eventually it'll break down and become compost. On the pathways, I used to use things like, I had a sawmill down the road. I used to go and collect wood off chips and stuff, and I put that down. It's too much to put on the top of your garden, but it would break down and become good compost for next season, and I'd scoop it up off the path and stick it on top. And so that way my pathways kept going down and my beds kept going up, and just keep adding more and more. So I see lots of people starting to go. I know it's after time. I just wanted to give you a chance to see if there's any more questions before we close up for tonight. What I might do too is just pop the link in the chat again in case you missed it for follow-up information of all the things that I've been mentioning. Forage Garden. There we go. Hang on. So thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I hope that works. If it doesn't, you can always email me on here?
We can send it out in the follow-up email with the recording as well.
Okay, great. There we go. Well, thank you so much to the Food Connect Shed for hosting this event. I think it's a wonderful thing to have these opportunities to connect and explore different ideas. I'd really welcome you to ask any questions that you have now, or if there's anything that you wanted to follow up and find out more about later. I'm really happy to field any questions ongoingly, because it's, you know, it's this wonderful world of exploration, and I find so much joy in being able to just walk out into a garden and just see what's there for today. Tonight, actually, I came across a bunya pine as I was walking home, and so I've got them out, and I'm going to cook up. Whoop, I can't see them. This is the bunya pine. Let me see that. So I'm going to cook them up and shell them and have them for dinner with some of my pumpkins that I've had to pull back off there. So that's going to be dinner tonight, with some self-seeded tomatoes thrown in and some herbs and bits and pieces. And it's always a wonderful adventure. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been really lovely to have your company this evening. I hope to see you again.
Thank you, Morag.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Jeff. Nice to see you. Bye, everyone.